Hey guys, how's it going? It's Krista, and today I wanted to create a crocus card that is really just for fun. For today's card, I'm using this photo for inspiration, and this is a photo that I took back in March of 2021. Crocuses are this color in my area, and I chose this photo as a color palette for inspiration for today's card. Today I'm using Sprouting Crocus Contour Layer craft dies from Birch Press Design, and I really like that these dies come on a magnetic sheet. And it also includes this little pamphlet just as instructions on how to put the crocus dies together, as well as some inspiration for your cards. I'm starting off today with some Strathmore cold pressed watercolor paper. I'll be using all of these dies today, so I'm just going to go ahead and set these down and run those through the die cut machine. I chose to make the leaves more green than they are in my inspiration photo, and today I chose Distress Oxide ink Bundled Sage as well as Distress ink Mowed Lawn. And I just went ahead and pressed those onto my Tim Holtz glass mat, and I'll put down some water with a spray bottle. I'm using a number 9 round brush to put down a base layer of color. Size isn't that important for the initial base layer on the leaves. And as I place down that pigment, I'm picking up a little bit of water, a little bit of the Distress Oxide ink starting near the bottom and pulling it to the top of the leaf. And it isn't really important that you start at the bottom and move up, just because this is a rather thin base layer of color. I'll be coming in later with some Mowed Lawn Distress ink to add some details. Right now my goal is just to have full coverage of the Distress Oxide Bundled Sage across the entire leaf. Next I'll come in with a number 2 round brush, and after picking up a little bit of water and a little bit of the Mowed Lawn Distress ink, I'm painting just kind of little lines on the leaves. I'm not covering the entire leaf die cut with the Mowed Lawn Distress ink. And to add some variation, I'll change up how far up the leaf I bring the Mowed Lawn Distress ink, as well as how thick I paint that ink on. And with those leaves painted, I'll set them aside to dry and bring in some Wilted Violet Distress Oxide ink, Dusty Concord Distress Oxide ink, as well as Seedless Preserves Distress Oxide ink. And just as I did before, I'll place those down on my glass mat and bring in a little bit of water from a spray bottle. And I really like the color of the Seedless Preserves as a base layer. And with these flower petals, I'm making sure to first place the pigment at the bottom of each of the die cuts and pull that pigment up to the top of the leaf with a brush that's not as loaded with pigment. Sometimes I would dip my brush in water, sometimes I would wipe it off, and just to add a little bit more variation, there are instances where I carried a loaded brush all the way to the top of the flower petal with the Seedless Preserves. When I do pull that color up to the top of the petal die cut, I'm making sure to place most of the pigment to the outside. This is where I want my shadows to be on my crocus. And even though I don't want a heavy pigment up the entire portion of the petal die cut, I am making sure that the entire die cut does have some of the Seedless Preserves color, even if it is blended out a little bit. And after taking the opportunity to clean off my brush, I'm coming back in with that number 2 round brush and using the Dusty Concord Distress Oxide ink with a little bit of water, I'm just painting what will be a shadow up the outer edge of each of the die cuts. I'm also choosing Dusty Concord color to paint the lines that have been scored in the die cut by the crocus die. And even though I've added water to the Dusty Concord Distress Oxide ink before applying it to the flower, I want to make sure after applying the pigment and water that I blend those lines out. And when I blend out those lines, the brush doesn't necessarily have to be very clean, but I do want the brush to be less loaded, either by dipping it in water and wiping off the excess on the glass mat, or taking the opportunity to wipe the brush on a paper towel. And I just noticed that I was painting in that little bit of Seedless Preserves ink. I have a heart in my ink. After taking a moment to clean off my brush, I'm going to come in with a little bit of water and the Wilted Violet Distress Oxide ink. And I'm going to place this pigment down next to the Dusty Concord to the inside. I can create variation with the Wilted Violet by changing the ratio of the Wilted Violet Distress Oxide ink to water. When adding more water to the ink, it creates a thinner, more translucent consistency, and when I add more ink and less water, it creates a thicker, more opaque consistency. And I'm being sure in some areas to overlap the Wilted Violet with the Dusty Concord. And regardless of the consistency that I place down with any of the inks, I want to make sure to go back and blend those pigments out. And once the inks have had a chance to dry, I can always go back in and add more of those pigments to create a more saturated color. For my background of my card front today, I have an embossing folder from Honeybee. This is Honeybee Wood Grain 3D embossing folder. And in my embossing folder today, I'm using a piece of 110-pound white cardstock. Before I load the cardstock into the embossing folder, I'm going to give it a quick mist on both sides with some water. This just really helps the texture from the embossing folder imprint into the paper. And I found that embossing folders from different companies may require shimming. So follow your sandwich with your particular die cut machine, but if you find that it's not quite working, try shimming some cardstock within your sandwich to add some extra pressure as it goes through the machine. Once the paper has been embossed, I decided to add some Perfect Pearls in confetti white, and I'm just adding that with an oval wash brush. I did gently remist the front before adding the Perfect Pearls. The downside to this is that the pearls will stick to your paintbrush a little bit, but they do wash out really easily with water. And also note, doing it this way, the pearls will stick to your entire background, both like the embossed and the debossed portions of your card front. I chose to add Perfect Pearls to the entire card front because I love the look of like a gilding polish on a card front. I don't have a gilding polish currently, so I'm using Perfect Pearls and a little bit of water to achieve a similar look. And also I found that adding the Perfect Pearls to the card front really brought out the wood grain design. The piece of paper that went through the embossing folder is a little bit larger than the embossing folder was. So I'm just going to trim that down to size, and then I'm going to trim that down even further to create the card front. This step could have been avoided altogether if I had cut down my rectangle prior to putting my cardstock through the embossing folder. Adding a mat was a secondary thought, and I've lost the ability to run this piece of cardstock through the die cut machine with a die because I'll lose some of that detail in the wood grain. So to cut this down to size, I'll use a scoring board and my paper trimmer. And I'm sorry that the measurements are just off camera, but I chose to cut this down to 4 inches by 5¼ inches just to give a really nice mat around the finished card front. And with this particular embossing folder, I don't have to worry about taking a portion of the trim off of each side. I can just lop it off the end because there's no continuous geometric pattern to this embossing folder. If I had chosen an embossing folder that had a pattern, I would have chosen to cut off a portion of the total area cut off from each of the sides. But seeing as this is a very natural, very organic image, I don't have to worry about ruining any patterns, so I can just cut the entire length from one side. Now that my flowers and my petals are completely dry, I'll put those together and adhere them together with some liquid adhesive. I don't think that there's a right way or a wrong way to put these die cuts together. This is the arrangement that I chose today, but there are also arrangement ideas in the little pamphlet that comes with these dies. I chose to glue these die cuts together with Tombow liquid adhesive. With the adhesive on those crocus flowers set aside to dry, I'll move on to my sentiment. Today I chose Thank You from CZ Design Clear Stamps Clean Line Gratitude Stamps and Die Set. And today I'm using a piece of 110-pound cardstock, and I'll just prepare that for embossing by using a dedicated paintbrush to remove any little debris that might be on my cardstock, and I'll come in with some powder to eliminate any static. And once I have that sentiment picked up, I'll come in with some Versamark ink and ink up my stamp before embossing it with Recollections Detail Gold embossing powder. And I'll go ahead and set that with my heat tool before cutting that sentiment out with the corresponding die. With my elements created, it's time to put this card together. And I'll just take a moment to find the layout of my card and ensure that my sentiment is straight by using a T-ruler. Then just to mark where I want the sentiment to be, I'll put a little dab of glue under the T and under the Y, just so that it's really easy for me to find that alignment again. And also I've lined up the crocus flowers over top of the A to help me find that sentiment placement, but I haven't yet glued them down. And just before I adhere that permanently, I want to give it a double check that it's straight with my T-ruler and press it down. I chose to add some glitter to my crocuses for that little bit of a highlight. And today I'm using a Aqua Nuvo shimmer pen in glitter gloss, especially when my elements are sitting on top of my card front. I like to kind of squeeze that glitter onto a glass mat and then pick it up with the brush nib and paint it over my die cuts. This prevents any accidental spillage of the glitter. Starting from the middle, I'll begin to adhere those crocus flowers down. And as I glue them down, I'll place an acrylic block over them just to hold them down. For the mat, I chose a shimmer purple cardstock from Recollections. And I'm just using 2 dies from Simon Says Stamp Basic Rectangle dies to create a frame. The largest rectangle is 5½ inches by 4¼ inches to bring this card front up to an A2 card base. And the inside rectangle is just one that I picked that created a frame that I liked. Once I have that ran through the die cut machine, I'll adhere the card front to the mat using liquid adhesive. And to finish up the card, I'll attach the entire card front to a note card base using that Tombow permanent liquid adhesive. And that concludes today's Just for Fun card. Thank you so much for watching. We'll see you next time. Bye for now.